So Dr. David Parrott and Ember Bradbury wrote a chapter in Great Salt Lake Biology, A Terminal Lake in a Time of Change, on shoreline plants. Dr. Dave Parrott is interested in the interactions between plants and the microbes they share the soil with. He is specifically interested in those interactions which might help in better understanding how plants tolerate drought or high soil salinity. As the assistant director of Great Salt Lake Institute, Dr. Parrott has a profound curiosity for the halophilic bacteria and fungi found in and around Great Salt Lake, and is also interested in the practical applications those microbes might lend themselves to. Dr. Parrott teaches a variety of biology classes, including cell biology, plant biology, and microbiology. He is committed to training students to not only communicate with other scientists, but to engage the public in ways that promote science learning, foster excitement and curiosity, and to inspire future scientists in the community. And Ember was one of Dave's students when she was at Westminster College. Ember Bradbury is a current Conservation Ecology master's student at University of Michigan in the Foufopoulos, did I get that right? The Foufopoulos Lab. That's hard to say. And she is a recipient of an award from the National Science Foundation. Her thesis focuses on the ecological impacts of agricultural land abandonment through monitoring soil nutrients, plant community, and invertebrate population changes on the Greek island of Naxos. I did today, I volunteered to go do her field work for her. So in case you want that, that's good. Really cool, I think she also works as a crisis advocate and birth doula and hopes to center community outreach and social justice throughout her career as an ecologist. During her undergraduate studies in biology and chemistry at Westminster College, she worked with Dave to complete research on the history and community composition of Great Salt Lake shoreline plants. And so Ember and Dave are going to tag team this talk, and Ember is going to start, but Dave is going to show his screen.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. I can see it. Cool. Yeah, so I'm Ember. I'm at UMich right now. And while I was at Westminster, Dave is my plant biology professor, and we did this chapter about shoreline plants of the Great Salt Lake. So I'll just kind of chat about how we looked into the history of botanists that examine these populations, and then kind of like what we found. Yeah. So like I said, we'll give a brief botanical history in that next slide. Is mostly about Seville flowers. So there's this one guy who's really, really cool. In 1934, he published this Vegetation Survey that was the first thing to demonstrate the biotic and abiotic factors of specifically the shoreline area. So that's the area between like the terrestrial part and like the traditional kind of sagebrush communities that we would see, and then also in between the aquatic part. And not including the wetland plants, which Karin will talk about later. So he was the first person to do this, and he cataloged the plant communities, floristic characteristics, water composition, and soil salinity. And we really pulled out the plant communities and floristic characteristics. And then also notably, they haven't changed that much since the 1934 studies. And that's noted in a bunch of different reviews that we found. Next slide. Yeah, so there isn't that much work done on the shoreline area. So really what we pulled from the most were these old historic studies. And I went to the Natural History Museum mostly and looked at these really cool index card catalogs and found a different variety of field notes and USGS mineral surveys. But mostly I'd like to point out that they all cited flowers at some point. Next slide. So what we did to make our comprehensive key, which is kind of like the culmination of the chapter besides salt tolerance mechanisms, was we took all of Flowers' data and all of the work that was found from the NHMU and compared it with this data portal, SEINet, and that's a really good tool if you're an educator or a researcher, which is just a database of geotagged museum and citizen science specimen. And we use these coordinates if you're interested. And then we compared it with Flowers' data and created this big spreadsheet. And I think it was if there was more than like 32 instances in the SEINet data that we included it in the final key and kind of like most common species. Next slide. Yeah, so what we found.
All right.
Oh, you can go.
Oh, no, go ahead if you'd like.
Either way, but I can go very quickly. So basically there's 4 different categories of things that was confirmed in Flowers' work and then also in the SEINet data. And these 4 different categories you can go over, Dave.
All right. So the idea kind of behind this chapter was that a lot of people look at aquatic plants because Great Salt Lake is a lake. And I am particularly interested in how plants interact with microbes in the soil. And so it was sort of an easy step to talk about the plants that grow on the shoreline. But we really had to sort of dig around in some historic data to figure out what the shoreline actually composes or is comprised of. You know, you may go out to the lake during non-buggy times and find that, you know, you think the shoreline was just where the water is. And that's not necessarily the case. So you can break the sort of shoreline down into sort of 4 distinct parts, and then a part that's not quite, it's sort of the transition period or zone between shoreline and not shoreline. And so we can start where the soil is saturated with water. And depending on whether you're in the north or south arm, we call this the playa zone, and the soil salinity can be upwards of 20%. And that's too high for any plant to grow in, typically, in the soil at least. We're not talking aquatic plants here. So if we decrease the soil salinity down to around 5%-ish, then you can start getting pickleweed. And we'll talk a little bit more about pickleweed. It's a really curious plant. It's very tasty, you know, if you like salty stuff, I guess. And the one curious thing about pickleweed is it needs to germinate in fresh water, and then it can tolerate in salt water. Soil salt level decreases in the saltgrass zone to about 2.5%, and then decreases the further away you get from the lake. And depending on how high the lake is during, you know, abundant water times or very low times, the shoreline can shift a little bit. But like Ember said, typically the overall composition of plants along the shoreline hasn't really changed that much. It's a pretty severe environment. So we go from the salt grass zone to the Shadscale green molly zone, which is about 1.5% salinity, and then it increases even more into this sort of transition zone where it's about a little bit less than 1%. And this is where we get greasewood, and then greasewood then transitions into greasewood sage, and then you're basically off the actual shoreline. And so these different zones have been categorized all the way back from Flowers all the way into more present day research. And if you look at this map, the big white part in the center is either the lake or exposed lake bed. And we can really talk about these 4 zones as they sort of circle around the lake. And so you can see that pickleweed zone is about 10% clay, 10% sand, silt. Well, it's 10% clay, sand, 10% silt, and 80% just outright clay. Saltgrass decreases a little bit, so we get a little bit less clay and a little bit more silt. And as we get further away from the actual lake bed, then we decrease the clay more and more. And this allows for you know, more normal, if you will, terrestrial plants, those plants that you would see growing around on regular type soils. So these sort of surround different pockets of Great Salt Lake. So depending on where you're located and how high upslope you are from the actual lake bed, you'll see a difference in the actual plants. And one curious thing that's happening at the lake bed or the playa zone, or especially in the pickleweed zone, is that these plants draw a lot of minerals out of the soil. And what this does, in effect, is it decreases the amount of clay and increases the amount of sand. And this is really for the plant's benefit, because what it does is it allows for more ready water retention and availability to the roots of the plant. And so we've got some studies going on about what the composition of microbes is in these different kinds of soils, and it does change. And so the plant is really changing its environment in order to survive. Okay, Ember, back to you.
Yeah, so back to the plants that are there. This is the full key that I made using a bunch of different sources. And again, these are the ones that are the most common on the shoreline area. And next slide. Yeah. So like we said earlier, there's a few different distinct communities, the first of which being the pickleweed. So you'll see pickleweed, and then also greasewood is pretty prevalent, and as well as, next slide please, red swamp fire and bud sage. So if you see the like really red fields that pop up sometimes, that's red swamp fire, and I always think that's really interesting. Next slide. And then we have this transition to more grass communities. So in the grass communities, you'll see desert saltgrass, alkali sactin, which is sometimes even used as an ornamental, and dropseed. And they have a very different salt tolerance mechanism that Dave will talk about later. But I do want everyone to keep in mind the kind of like harsh distinction between seeing these more succulent looking plants and then also these salt plants. I always think that's really interesting. Okay, next slide. And then in the Shadscale community, you see more succulent kind of looking thing, shadscale, as well as gray molly, which starts to transition, in my mind anyway, a little bit more into that sagebrush scrub looking kind of plants. But these are really common and also really beautiful. They're kind of succulent, kind of fuzzy, kind of intricate. Okay, next one. And then finally, there's the Greasewood community. And if you remember from earlier, Greasewood is also found in the pickleweed area, but it starts to get more prominent as we move out towards the sagebrush area. So we'll see Greasewood and iodine bush, which is my favorite plant because it kind of stacks on top of each other. And then we'll also see some peppering of the more like terrestrial, well, solid terrestrial plants, like I said earlier, the sagebrush area. Okay.
All right, so yeah, it's a really interesting cross section to look at. But all of these plants have to adapt to salty environment, because typical soil, say in your yard, if you live in Salt Lake City or wherever you happen to live, there's almost no salt in those soils. Plants are extremely susceptible to damage by salt, either by salt poisoning plants or salt, which is keeping water away from plant roots. And so there are a couple of different mechanisms we can talk about when we're talking about at least Great Salt Lake plants. And there are, for every species of plant that grows near Great Salt Lake or in any salty environment, there are a multitude of different mechanisms. But we'll talk about a couple that are really kind of interesting. So saltgrass is really cool because saltgrass actually will actively take up water out of the soil, like all plants do. But these plants don't have a way of filtering salt out. So what they have to do then is somehow deal with the salt that they're bringing up into their roots. And saltgrass does this in a really weird and interesting way. It will actually pull water out of the soil, and it will bring this into each individual cell in the plant. But as it is photosynthesizing and it's respiring and its water is evaporating, it actually takes salt out of the cells individually and pumps them out, secretes the salt crystals out through this specialized mechanism. They're trapped in these collector cells, and those collector cells go through this elaborate sort of way out to these secretion cells. And then the salt is secreted onto the surface of the leaf where it can't change the dynamic of water intake inside the plant cell. And so you can look under a microscope. Sometimes you can just rub your hand over the leaf surface of saltgrass and taste, and it's, sure enough, it's very salty. And that's not coming from water that might be vaporized and blowing off onto the surface itself. It's actually coming from inside the plant, secreting outside. It's really quite cool. Succulent plants have a different way of dealing with this. Succulent plants typically are succulent. They have these big membranes inside to hold a lot of water, because we're talking about a lake, right? But it's a very salty lake, and that water is not really accessible to these plants very readily. And especially in the North Arm, where the salt in the water is extremely high, we find that these plants are really living in drought-like conditions. They're on the shores of a lake, but the water is very inaccessible to them because of the soil and because of the salt. And so these succulent plants retain as much water as they can. So pickleweed is a succulent, like iodine bush and some of these others. But what pickleweed does is, as it's growing, it's sequestering salt. It's putting salt into what's called the central vacuole of the cell. Every plant cell has this, but pickleweed really uses this as a repository for all of this excess salt. So it filters the salt through the cellular components, dumps them into this big sack, basically, which is filled with water and a lot of salt. And then as the plant grows, these little pickles form on the very top of the plant. And those pickles, in other areas of the world where they don't die off in the winter, those will actually turn red and fall off. And that's how the plant gets rid of all of its salt. Here, the whole plant might die. Oh, excuse me. The whole plant might die, and then regerminate again in the spring, but it will keep sequestering salt in this same manner. So those are a couple of different ways plants deal with salt. Some of our research right now is looking at what microbes in the soil do to help alleviate this salt and drought problem that these shoreline plants have. And if you're curious, I'll do a little plug here at the end. There's this fantastic book that this series is built upon. Bonnie and Jamie are the editors of this book. We were lucky enough to contribute this chapter on shoreline plants. And if you're curious about looking at Ember's amazing keys, or learning a little bit more about the different kinds of mechanisms of salt tolerance in plants, by all means, go and check the book out. And that's all we've got.
Thank you,
I'll
Dave.
give it back to Jamie.